Good evening or good morning, wherever you are. Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. We are continuing our story about the Aryan invasion debate. And now we're going to look into a dimension that is quite new and quite sensational, namely the literary evidence. So this term literary evidence suggests that there has been writing about the disintegration of Proto-Indo-European unity, that some of the emigration history from the homeland has actually been described by a human observer. Now, until today or until recently, this was thought impossible. The disintegration of Proto-Indo-European was dated to about 3700 BC, 4000 maximum, but quite far removed from the oldest writings in either Hittite or Mycenaean Greek or Vedic Sanskrit, which were all three dated to about 1500 BC, so easily more than 2000 years after the disintegration, when that had been completely forgotten. So the existing languages of 1500 BC were already quite unaware of their own migration history. That at least was the consensus until recently. Now, Srikantalagiri, a so-called bank clerk from Mumbai, that's how he has made his living. He worked in a bank, now retired. He was an amateur historian, you could say. And in fact, much of his work is about the Rig Veda. When he first read the Rig Veda and already drew important conclusions militating against the Aryan invasion theory, he read it only in English translation, because even in translation, and so far all the English translations are a bit clumsy, he already could find a number of pieces of information that went against the Aryan invasion theory. Well, what he shows is that Rig Vedic history goes back much farther than 1500 BC, and that indeed it reports on at least the last phases of the disintegration, namely in some detail about the emigration of the Iranians from India, and even has some vague memories of even the earlier stages of emigration. So nobody expected to find that. And he shows rather offhand that, of course, such information is available. Now, to find much human data in the Rig Veda requires a few things. First of all, that you read what is there. There is a lot of history in the Rig Veda, even though it was not meant as a history book. But you see, offhand, human beings hardly can do otherwise than to give information about their own life, the setting of their own life, their own doings. And so you find a lot of information in the Rig Veda, such as where it took place. There are no giraffes, no ice bears, no penguins. You see no zebras in the Rig Veda. What you find is the fauna and the flora of northwestern India. Then, in terms of chronology, what you find is that people are not living in the Stone Age, nor are they living in the age of the automobile. They are very definitely living in the Bronze Age. So it's a Bronze Age text. And it gives some details about a number of human events, marriages, battles, genealogies. So it's a very human document that gives a lot of information about the lives of people, even though that is not strictly the object with which the Vedic hymns were written. Then secondly, you have to know that there is a certain layeredness within the Rig Veda. There are older books, books of the middle period, and then the youngest book. The family books are the oldest, that is, of the 10 books, book 2 to 7, of which the 6th book is the oldest, followed by the 3rd, followed by the 7th. After these 6 family books comes book 8. Then you have book 1, which is a collection of the remainder of hymns, already starting in the early period and going on till and including the period of the 8th book. Then you have the 9th book of the Soma hymns, again added later, but its hymns may be older. Then centuries later, another book is added, which becomes the 10th book. And that is clearly younger and is about the same age, is in the same cultural setting, which is already very different from the early ones, together with the Yajur Veda and the Atharva Veda. Now, this layeredness, this sequence of books within the Rig Veda is not some far-fetched little idea of a marginal amateur historian. No, you see, they are just accepted by the community of students of India, of Orientalists. And they have been invented, or at least not invented, but worked out in some detail by Herman Oldenberg at the end of the 19th century. And so they are pretty uncontroversial. Only they are never applied until now. So what Talageri at first already saw, still a bit unsophisticated, but that's precisely its strength. It is something that everybody ought to see. There is a clear geographical gradient. The oldest books are the most easterly. They still know of the Ganga River, they're quite familiar with it. Then the middle books are firmly centered around the Saraswati River in Haryana. Then the expansion comes to West Punjab, all the way to Afghanistan. Ultimately, in the 8th book, they are very familiar with Afghanistan. They bring in the Afghanistan flora and fauna. That's not for the first book. That's not the beginning of the Veda, where the supposed Aryans moved in coming from Afghanistan. No, on the contrary, that's only one of the last books when they go to Afghanistan. So there is a geographical gradient. You can also see it by the lakes and the mountains mentioned. It is all clearly east to west. There is also a technological gradient, which already contains some chronological information. The oldest chariots are from about 2200 BC. Till recently, there were only those found in Russia, then a bit younger, those found in Mesopotamia, and seemingly there was nothing in the Harappan area. It was deduced, but not really corroborated archaeologically, that the first chariots were brought into India by the Aryans, who again came in around 1500 BC. Now, meanwhile, there has been an archaeological discovery of a chariot dating about 2100 BC, and found in the eastern part of the Vedic area in western UP. But the technology there is that the chariot is an innovation and is described effectively in the youngest, the 10th book of the Rig Veda. However, that was a sophisticated version of the cart, the wagon, which could be quite large, designed to transport whole families or group of people. But it was an ordinary slow-moving cart, and it is described throughout the Rig Veda. So you can see the Rig Veda knew of wheeled vehicles, but not yet of chariots until the end. You can see within the Rig Veda this process of technological innovation. So the fact that there are chariots in the Veda does not mean, as many Orientalists used to think, that the whole Veda dates from the age of the chariot. No, a part of the Rig Veda dates from before the age of the chariot. And it's only the last part that is part of the age of the chariot. Now, what is the story in ethnic terms? There are, for the Rig Vedic people, 5 tribes that they have to deal with. One is themselves, of course, the Pauravas. But you have in the west the Druhyus, in the north the Anavas, in the south the Yadavas, and to their east the Turvashas. These are the 5 tribes. They undergo a certain history. The Anava tribe, together with the Paurava tribe, fights against the western Druhyus and defeats them, and the Druhyus disappear to the northwest. It is said in a different text, namely the Puranas, that which have a whole memory of even pre-Vedic history that was passed on orally, that is certainly not perfect, but that is not to be ignored either. So they speak of the Druhyus going to the northwest and setting up kingdoms there, with, for example, the Afghan city of Gandhara or Kandahar being named after one of the Druhyu chieftains. So these Druhyus belong to the distant memory of the Rig Veda. They are not part of what the Rig Vedic people themselves describe and see, but they are still in their collective memory. It is the Anavas who mainly take their place geographically, namely West Punjab. And then another war develops between the Anavas and the Pauravas themselves, the Pauravas being the Vedic tribe. That is very firmly described. It is mainly the Battle of the 10 Kings, described in the 7th book, and then a few generations later, the Varshagira battle, described in the 4th and the 1st book. In a few of the hymns, there's not much attention to these stories, but there is attention paid to them. We get quite a bit of information. And so we see that in the Battle of the 10 Kings, it is a coalition around a number of kings who are named, who all have Iranian names. The tribal names of the groups involved, all Iranian. The religion that is described is Zoroastrianism, clearly recognizable. So what we know as the Iranians were then called the Anavas, the descendants of Anu. They fight against the Pauravas. They come with a coalition of 10 kings, but to everybody's surprise, they get defeated. So there you get the start of the expulsion of the Anavas from India northwestward. And the next battle, the Varshagira battle, takes place in Afghanistan, in the southeastern border of Afghanistan, and it is rather inconclusive. The Vedic people claim victory, but not with the same degree of conviction as in the Battle of the 10 Kings. But the other side also claims victory. And effectively, here we find something very rare in ancient history. namely that one event is described, has been preserved in testimony from both sides of the conflict. So we have a Vedic account, we also have an Avestan account. And that is also triumphalist, that also claims victory. And I think that in this case, the victory was rather on the Iranian side. At any rate, the end result is that the situation stabilizes, that the Vedic tribes stay in India, that the Iranians stay in Afghanistan, that now there's a good fence between them, the Hindu Kush Mountains. And so from then onwards, this conflict is over, relations are restored. We find, for example, descriptions of Iranians who patronize the Vedic hymns, the Vedic careers of a number of Vedic rishis. But it has left certain scars, certain typical traits of both the Zoroastrian, Iranian religion and the Vedic religion. For example, perhaps most importantly, the words used for gold become different. Until then, both the words Asura and Deva mean gold. Now you get a differentiation. The word Asura was most used by the Iranians. So for them, Asura, or in their version, Ahura, means gold. And Daiva comes to mean demon. On the other side, it is the other way around. For the Vedic people, the Devas remain the gods, the Asuras become the demons. And that remains standard usage even now that the memory of this Vedic-Iranian conflict is completely gone. So we have a clear Vedic testimony of the last phase of the emigration from the homeland of the Iranians. We have an Iranian testimony clearly in consensus with it, and so that's a very rare form of multiple literary evidence of a very important event. So nobody expected it. It is Shrikant Talageri's merit that he discovered it. At this point, I might also say that in the Battle of the Ten Kings, a very important event takes place that will have a great influence on the image of Indo-European disintegration, and particularly the interpretation of this process. You see, from the later 19th century till 1945, the end of the Second World War, there was a very strong and rather vicious racial interpretation at work, which still leaves its traces in modern Indian politics, something of which most in the West don't know. Namely, there is just a very cursory mistranslation with enormous consequences. In the description of the Battle of the Ten Kings, it is said offhand that the enemies of the Vedic tribe are the Asikni Jana. Now, Asikni Jana can mean literally the black people. And so this has been interpreted by translators in the late 19th century, the heyday of the race theories, as meaning the black aboriginals. So to them it was the story of the white Aryan invaders against the dark, snub-nosed, Dravidian-speaking aboriginals. It is that story that has more or less won the day, that is still vaguely believed by Westerners, though by now they do not attach much political importance to it anymore, and by a number of forces in India, chiefly the Christian missionaries and the Ambedkarites, the so-called Dalit movement, as well as the Dravidianist movement, which at one point became the Tamil separatist movement. So for India, this is a vital interest. For the West, it used to be that. Now it has only scholarly interest, but still it remains something important. The idea that the main event of the Rig Veda, the Battle of the Ten Kings, is all about a confrontation between white invaders and dark natives. Now that is not at all what that verse says. Who are the Asikni Jana? Jana means people. So we are dealing with a number of people, but they are not themselves Asikni by skin color. They are not black skinned. No, they come from the Asikni River. The Black River is what is now called the Chenab, a river in West Punjab. So that river was innocently called the Black River, probably because it looked dark. It's a very normal name for a river. But it is just a place name. You see, the enemies came from the Chenab River. They came to hunt down the Vedic king Sudas at the Ravi River to their east. This is already something that doesn't really fit the Orientalist story, because in the Orientalist story you would have the white invaders coming from the west, attacking the natives in the east. Here is just the reverse that happens. The enemies, the Anavas or Iranians, they come from the west, and the Vedic people are in the east. So that is unexpected. And the Vedic people win, which means they are moving not east deeper into India, but more to the west, closer to Afghanistan. So it is a very innocent verse. It simply describes the people, the Iranians, at that moment enemies, coming from the west, coming from the Asikni or Dark River. It's so innocent, and yet it is the center of a whole network of racist associations and their political implications working till today. So that brings us to the political aspect of the Aryan invasion debate. We will conclude with that. Today there is something I would call stonewalling of the Aryan invasion camp against the Out of India case. They are not reading the books of defending the Out of India case. They are not entering into debate with them. There has been a little bit of debate around the year 2000, but that's over. Today there is a firm stonewalling. It is being said time and again, oh, the OIT, the Out of India theory, that's Hindu nationalist, that's associated with the ugly, vicious Hindu nationalists. We don't want to have anything to do with that. Now, first of all, from a scholarly viewpoint, even if it were true, this is completely irrelevant. You see, even a politicized source, a biased source, can be right once in a while. So a scientist would not wonder, what company does this theory put me in? With what kind of politics is it associated? No, he would first of all wonder, is this theory correct? Is it right? Is it true? Secondly, the theory, while irrelevant, also happens to be wrong. The founders of Hindu nationalism happen to be believers in the Aryan invasion theory, perhaps mainly because of the prestige at that time of Western scholarship. You see, they just didn't dare to go against that, so they vaguely heard that, Western scholars had decided there had been an Aryan invasion, so they complied with that. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, writer of the book Hindutva, and that way effectively the basic ideologue of Hindu nationalism, he explicitly believed in an Aryan invasion. Only he argued that this was not so relevant because so-called Aryans, so-called Dravidians, so-called tribals, they had all been mixed to some extent. And, as he said, even an Andamanese tribal has a sprinkling of the so-called Aryan blood, and therefore it doesn't really matter. We are one genetic continuum, maybe some with a bit more Aryan element, others with a bit more native element, but if at all you want to bring in the racial viewpoint, we are all more or less one race. So for him, that Aryan invasion was not so important, but he did accept it. Another Hindu nationalist leader, Bala Gangadhar Tilak, even made his own variation on the Aryan invasion theory. He did not put the homeland in South Russia, but rather in North Russia or even beyond, in the Arctic. For him, the homeland was at the North Pole, or somewhere close to that. That was only his own interpretation of an Aryan invasion theory that he had heard from the British. Nevertheless, many Westerners nowadays use Tilak as an argument in favor of the Aryan invasion theory, and with the extra bonus that it was an Indian who said it. So they say to Hindus who defend the out of India theory, no, it must be the Aryan invasion theory, because even an Indian like Bala Gangadhar Tilak said so. Whereas the fact that he was Indian is quite immaterial. He is just one of the people, Westerner or Indian, who accepted the dominant theory, which at that time was unambiguously the Aryan invasion theory. Some upper caste people in India even were enthusiastic about the Aryan invasion theory. They based their own pretense of superiority on it. You see, at that time, the Europeans were saying, the European white Aryans came into India and became the upper castes. And therefore, some upper castes said, that puts us, a rung higher than the other castes. We are closer to our British overlords. So there was, and particularly among conservative and casteist Hindus, there was a certain sympathy for the Aryan invasion theory. Also among expatriate Indians, like the first Hindus here in America, they used this Aryan theory in order to be accepted by the dominant whites as fellow whites, as Aryans, which the Americans were not sure about accepting. Ultimately, in 1923, a judge rejected this argument. Conversely, it is the low-caste leader Ambedkar, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, who rejected the Aryan invasion theory, and who emphatically said, if there was such a thing as Brahmins and Dalits, they were of the same race. If the Brahmins were Aryans, then the Dalits were Aryans too. Nevertheless, his followers today mostly espouse the Aryan invasion, as do the Dravidian chauvinists and separatists, as do also their missionary patrons and their secularist patrons. A really nasty implication of this is anti-Brahminism, which, with only little exaggeration, I would call the Indian version of anti-Semitism. It's very similar in its stereotypes. if you take the anti-Brahmin cartoons, they are more or less the same as the Nazi cartoons about the Jews. And so sometimes this flares up, as after the murder of Mahatma Gandhi. There was a big massacre of Brahmins, at least hundreds, I'm even told. The figure 8,000, I don't know. But so it was a very serious massacre in 1948, which had the murder of Gandhi by someone who was a Brahmin as its occasion, but which had a deeper cause, the much older anti-Brahmin propaganda. In Europe too, there has been a politicization of this theory a bit earlier. Today, few people care about it. In fact, they tend to be a bit embarrassed about the whole debate. Most scholars try to not work on it. There are enough other useful things to do, even within Indo-European linguistics. The concern for origins is a bit quaint, is biblical, is medieval, is feudal. The day when you were important because your grandfather had been important, rather than on the basis of your own merits. So this is deemed quaint and therefore is avoided. It's perhaps typical for India that they still are concerned with it. See, they have no hang-ups about it. In the West, mainly the experience of Nazism and what it has led to has put people off from this whole Aryan debate. The word Aryan itself already warns people off. Nevertheless, earlier, it was a very important subject. So first of all, you had British colonialism that made use of it. The British said, we have every right to be in India. After all, the Hindus themselves were only Aryan invaders, just as we are. And therefore, they shouldn't complain. In fact, they should be happy. They themselves mixed. They themselves diluted their own superior genetic markers. And they should be happy that we as pure Aryans have come over to rule them, to put them in the right direction, to govern them much better than they themselves could have done. The Viceroy, Lord Curzon, in the beginning of the 20th century, called it the furniture of empire. You see, to build an empire, you need an ideology. And so within that ideology, the Aryan invasion theory is the best possible backbone. But the worst political use of it was definitely by National Socialism. Its main race theorist, Hans Günther, took the Aryan invasion theory as the paradigm for the Nazi worldview. First of all, you have the dynamic white Aryans who go all the way to India there to defeat the Aborigines, who are indolent and who are not as capable as the Aryans and therefore are easily subjugated. Then the Aryans imposed the caste system in order to preserve their own race. So this was the illustration of the race theory. Superior peoples, superior races are race conscious, and they try to preserve their race. Unfortunately, they were not strict enough. They were not hard enough in imposing it. And so they mixed to a little extent, and generation after generation, this becomes important, and their race degenerated, became, well, something halfway between the original Aryan superiority and the degeneracy of the Aboriginal race. But fortunately for them, they were saved by the colonization by a whiter Aryan nation, And in this case, you see, the British were as good as the Germans. After all, the Anglo-Saxons themselves had come from Germany originally. And so it is very good that this superior white race came to India to rule over the half Aryans, which are the upper castes, and then the full aboriginals, which are the lower castes. So you had the whole Nazi worldview summed up in this Aryan invasion theory. So the most politicized historical theory ever that I can think of is precisely the Aryan invasion theory. This is remarkable because there are many scholars in the West who try to avoid the whole debate and who particularly try to avoid the out of India theory because, according to what little they have heard about it, it is wrapped up, it is too involved with politics, namely with Hindu nationalist politics. Now, in fact, the theory was created in Europe in the 18th century when there was no Hindu nationalism in sight. Then later it was revived in India also purely for scholarly reasons, though then later politicians, particularly of the Hindu nationalist tendency, saw its use, not so much for its own sake, but in order to combat the Aryan invasion theory that had done so much harm to India and keeps on doing harm to India. So to conclude, it is a misconception very common among Hindus that linguistics necessarily implies an Aryan invasion theory. Indeed, I think that linguistics itself can be shown to support the out of India theory, at any rate can be shown not to prove an Aryan invasion. Genetics as it is now is not very pertinent. It still allows of different readings. There are conflicts among experts about the results so far, but in any case, it is not prohibitive of the out of India theory, not in terms of the results arrived at so far, but not especially in principle. Genetics does not say very much about the language that migrating people spoke. Archaeology too is so far not absolute evidence for the out of India theory. However, it strongly militates against the Aryan invasion theory. It has not been sufficiently applied to Central Asia, especially in order to give a definitive verdict on whether there was an emigration from India, but it certainly militates against the idea that there was a migration into India. So archaeology, even more than linguistics or genetics, militates against the Aryan invasion theory. I think at this point there is very little evidence to support this Aryan invasion theory. There is more evidence for an out of India scenario. Thank you.